Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Pep Organ. My name is Titus, I'm an organist and a composer, and I believe strongly in music that speaks to the heart. I believe that music should compel the listener, and it should have universal and timeless values that are eternal and last through the ages so that music can be appreciated for all eternity. I've got the absolute privilege today to talk to Carl Korsnes, who is a philosopher from Norway. He holds a double BA in philosophy and political science from Westchester University of Pennsylvania and an MA in philosophy from the University of Oslo. He's also the editor and the founder of Civilisation magazine, which is a magazine devoted to sharing timeless modern art from around the world. Carl, lovely to have you on the channel.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's a really impressive channel that you have, the YouTube channel, and it's been a joy to listen to the pieces that you've written.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful how we can meet each other online through something like Zoom and have a conversation about art and things that are universal.
Yeah, definitely. I was actually this coming summer. I was supposed to go to Australia for the first time because the International Congress of Philosophy was supposed to be held there this year for the first time in Australia, and then it was cancelled due to the COVID-19.
That's unfortunate.
It's as close as I get to Australia now.
Hopefully in future then, or hopefully we can come to Norway and and meet you. So tell us about your magazine first, because it's been a big project of yours. What is Civilisation magazine?
Civilisation magazine is a magazine devoted to classical culture, as we call it, and philosophy. So my background is, as you mentioned, in philosophy. So we do write about some topics of today, but we try to write it in the way that it's supposed to be able to be read in 500 years and be almost just as relevant. So if there's something about the current situation, whatever it is, then you can try to make it into a philosophical topic. So instead of writing about the corona the corona lockdown, you can talk about how to preserve the freedom of the people and how to run a government, for instance. So that's one part of it, and then the second part is the classical culture as opposed to modernist culture. And then, so for instance, it's classical figurative painting instead of the modernistic abstract painting, and we covered the melodic music instead of the atonal music, for instance. And we found that, at least in Norway, but I would say quite internationally, we experienced that to be a vacuum, that it was not, wasn't filled by, like there are hundreds, if not thousands, of culture magazines, but everyone cover almost the same. And,
yeah.
And at least if they have trying to reach out instead of just staying within their little bubble. So we are trying to reach out. Of course, Norway is a small country, but we will hopefully soon go international. So,
it seems that all the magazines have sort of converged into the same kind of thinking, same in Australia and anywhere in the world now, the same kind of language. So your goal is to stand out from the crowd in that way and to share what you find to be objective, universal, relevant for all time, I assume.
Yes, trying to find the universal values, and to some people that's almost offensive to say, but that you can, how dare you to say that you know what is universal, but it should be something that should be strived towards. It's not, I don't like to have this metaphysical viewpoint that I know the truth, but trying to reach closer to a conclusion. That is what philosophy is all about.
Absolutely. I think in the idea, when you want to bring up something like timeless or universal, often people may criticize that you're really just showing a bias towards classical culture, especially Western Europe around the age of the Renaissance, for instance. What do you say to that sort of criticism?
Well, I would say that that's a very good example of a culture that has managed to get close to something universally human. But you can find it in many other cultures as well. You can find it in the, if I remember correctly, it's the Edo period in Japan, and you can find it in the bronze busts from Nigeria that are hundreds of years old. They all have this very humanistic, very very sensible. They're very much appealing to the senses, and they are trying to uplift the human form, or the human, trying to uplift the human being in a way of making it beautiful, or making it grander than nature. And there are several examples of that. Also in during the Inca kingdom in Peru. Although they usually never show those very classical pieces from the Inca kingdom, they usually show the very typical tribal with straight forms and simplistic forms. And that is definitely a part of the culture. But they did have a period of time when they had very expressive faces and very beautiful shapes that they were making.
I'd love to talk about this more for sure. But before we jump back to the magazine again, do you think that there's a sort of cultural convergence that leads towards this style of representational art, or do you think that it comes in sort of cycles, perhaps?
I do believe that it comes in cycles, but not, or maybe it's the wrong word to use to say I believe, because then it sounds metaphysical, that it's something, that it's a system I believe in. But I'm convinced of a theory by Franz Brentano, a philosopher that I very much admire, and he observed, when reading history of philosophy, he observed that it seems like the history of philosophy goes in cycles, that it goes from the what he called scientific, but you should not think of it as the modern scientific necessarily, but the view of testing and always questioning the result. And then it goes from there to the practical, because then you rely too much on the philosophy, and it's like, well, this works, so now we can start getting practical. But then it doesn't work that well, and then you end up becoming skeptical, and this happens over like hundreds of years. And skepticism doesn't fulfill the need that human beings have for answers, and then it becomes mystical. Then you start inventing systems that are not supposed to be proven by empirical or logical research. So then it goes to cycles, and I think we are at the bottom level now, and how to get up to the highest point, he isn't that clear about that, although it's just a theory, but I think it makes sense.
Yeah, having read Brentano myself, I've found that it makes sense theoretically, but it's often, history is more messy than a theory can always provide for. But I would wanted to see, I suppose Brentano could apply that theory to all cultures then, not just to a Western history.
Mm-hmm.
So then I just want to make that point clear for the viewers that the discussion we're having is not just about Western culture, but it's really about all cultures and how they interact. I really like that Brentano doesn't buy into either a narrative of decline or of progress. And I think that that's a really great way to keep your head level about what era you're living in and whether things can improve in the future or whether they will decline, and just see it with a more sort of observer lens rather than a really charged emotional investment in it, which I think a lot of philosophers do, right? They substitute emotion for what should be philosophy, should be empirical.
Yeah. And then the answers become very very absolute, and then the philosopher doesn't become the nobleman that he used to be. To acknowledge that one has limited knowledge.
So you've just talked about the Brentano's idea of the four phases of philosophy, perhaps, which can cycle themselves. And you say that we're sort of in the low point now, a sort of mystical phase where people just accept their own personal expression and don't care about something more objective. I wanted to ask you, so we've come to this point where we have abstract paintings and atonal music is considered to be the highest form of art. Not a form of art, but the highest. How on earth did we get here?
Well, that's a good question. I think it has that you can see traces of it in history from many cultures. I don't know all cultures that well, so therefore I'm using the Western culture as an example. But one can see it from, for instance, in the Dark Middle Ages. Then you see some similar ideology, or you see traits of the society or the culture being ruled or run by ideology instead of rationality or even practicality, but more ideological. And so, for instance, when a building or a painting or music piece is not supposed to give something to the human being, but to give something to, it could be God, or it could be some other belief in something that has taken God's place.
Like a political ideology, for example.
Yes, like a political ideology, which is that is most common in our age, I would say. But it's I would say that looks like it's the overarching reason. But then I could point to some ideologies that I think have been crucial to the way culture has evolved or decreased in a way. I would say that one of them, to me, the most crucial is to separate craft from art. And I think it's in every what we call art form, painting, music, sculpture, I think it's so crucial to always remember that it is a craft, because then the product is the focus. That's the goal, is to make a product. And if that is removed, although it can be a fantastic product that erases a lot of emotions and make you feel that this is something more, but if you actually try to reason that it's something more or something different than craft, then I think it goes the wrong direction, because then it's usually that it's not the product that is in focus, but it's rather the act itself. So you can see that in modernistic art or in music or everything. It's the artist is expressing himself or herself, and then it's the act that becomes the central part. And then, of course, in the beginning, it just started very slightly that, yes, the act is important too, and the craft is less important. But then it evolves in the direction that why should it have any importance at all, the product? And that's how it has ended up in the way it has. Like with the ultimate example with the, I don't remember, I don't like to advertise for modernistic art, but there is a piece that is silence, like a piano player is supposed to go out and play, and the art is that it's nothing, and it's like, oh, that's a that's supposed to be something theoretically amusing and something that tells you something about the process before the product, because the product is no longer important. And I think that's how it has declined.
Yeah, I'd be great to talk more about how that process came about, because it's definitely a complicated one, going from basically musicians, especially thinking of themselves as craftsmen, and then through the help of a few philosophers and the help of a few societal changes, they became viewed as perhaps the greatest people in society, the sort of visionaries. So it'd be great to talk about that more. Now, I think in your philosophy, or the way you think of it, we should be removing our personality from our art. Now, can you explain what that means exactly?
Yeah, I think that it's quite related to what I just mentioned. That I was trying to find where is the elephant in the room? Where is the what's the source of the problem in a way? And I found that one thing that had not been challenged that much is the topic of expression, that the artist is supposed to express himself or herself or the feelings or something like that. And then I was inspired by Aristotle when I read his Poetics, because he praises Homer. And he says that he is the greatest poet of all, because he doesn't mix in his own voice in his poetry. And I was thinking about that that is very much in conflict with how we regard poetry or painting or music today. So I was thinking it makes sense, and Aristotle has come to the right conclusion in many cases. So I was trying to, okay, so what are the benefits of voice? And I found there to be many benefits that I think are crucial. It becomes more, the message itself becomes clearer, because you don't mix up your own voice into a story or into a music piece. And so that's one part of it. And it's also that, let me try to rephrase it. For something to be a craft, it has to be learned. And that is what Immanuel Kant says. He says that the art genius, cannot learn his geniusness, or the feature of being a genius. Because if it was possible to learn, then it's just crafts. Then he's just a craftsman. And so then for something to be a craft, it has to be learned. Then you have it from somewhere else. It's not that you have what is subjective is something that you have from different sources, and when trying to express that as something original or something unique to you, when you have learned it from someone, it becomes something that it says that it is something that it's not.
Is it possible to remove our personality entirely?
No, I don't think so. Maybe, but that is some of the criticism that I've heard of this theory of mine, although I've borrowed it from Aristotle and just expanded on it, and that is, well, it's not possible, but that's not the point. The point is that it's something to strive towards, and when you strive towards it, then you honor the craft, because you realize that you're not supposed to be yourself, whatever that is, or to express yourself, but to express the craft as good as possible. And then the result, I would argue, becomes better, or the product becomes better. Maybe not the expression, but I don't think that's the point.
It's such a problem today because if you go to any art gallery or a performance of music, you look at the artwork and then your eyes flick straight to the who did it, right? You've got the name there, and then you start trying to build some kind of profile of the person. The same thing goes for the music. Whereas if you don't have that information and you're just trying to analyze the thing itself, then you can try and judge it, right? You can make a better judgment about it rather than trying to explain to yourself all sorts of things like, oh, maybe he's from this country, or it's a woman, so maybe she'll compose in a certain way, and you just instead focus on the actual product itself. I think that's a really great part of that way of thinking. And again, that throughout history, people have, or at least from the history that we have available to us, it seems that so many artists have never felt the need to put their name on their craft, that throughout time, art was treated just like, building wheels, for example, and someone would learn from a master, and then they would imitate the master and perhaps surpass him, or perhaps, not be as good. But the point was that there would be a level of standard that you could at least expect, perhaps tied to, the brand in modern times, but in those times, whatever the equivalent of the guild was, perhaps. So you think that art should be viewed more like a craft in that sense, that we should have students learning from their masters these kinds of skills? Yeah,
and yes, definitely. And it's and again, here it's not black and white. It's not that it's either or, because I do definitely understand that you can have a fascination with someone that are so talented, and but it goes too far if you buy a painting just because it has a signature and it looks like something you could have made yourself. If you're mediocre, this focusing too much on the name can be traced back to, again, Immanuel Kant's view of the genius. And it was, although he usually gets very much the blame for the genius term, it was such a the philosophers around Immanuel Kant's time and after that, for a couple of hundreds of years, they were so obsessed with the genius. I've seen so many philosophers they do write about what is the genius. And usually sensible philosophers that I very much admire, they suddenly come to the genius, and then it's all about it's almost like writing about it's almost like you're reading Swedenborg, if you know him, the mystic who writes about angels and demons and everything. Although it's a remarkable book, it's very up there with it's not very much bound to earth. And the same with many thinkers who write about the genius, Emerson and Wolfgang Goethe, and
so they come up with this term for genius, and then they start to talk about it without actually thinking clearly about what that actually means and whether it's a real concept in the first place.
Yes, or or they have probably thought about it as whether it is a real, whether it exists or not, but it was just something that was very, very popular. And a few people saw the signs, I would say, but not that many. And
I'm sure no one expected that it would end up going as far as it did, right?
Yeah, because that's at least my view, that the genius has ended up being the artist that is not supposed to be understood. Because I guess that was why it was such a popular philosophical topic, because the genius is defined as someone who is not supposed to be understood. And then all the philosophers want to find out, oh, I can understand it. And so I've mentioned to, when I've had this conversation with some friends of mine, I usually mention the example of Franz Schubert. He wrote so impressively many pieces, and so many of them are just amazing. And his short life, and he wrote so many masterpieces. And he had this circle of friends where I think it was like half of them believed that he had a gift from God, and that is the genius, the mystical, you're not supposed to understand it. And the other half believed that, or they knew that he was working as hell, that this was his life, and he really worked for it, and he suffered through it, and he deserves only respect. Because it's also, although there are many artists who lack talent, who live very well off the genius idea, the artist idea. They cannot paint, and they are hailed as geniuses, or they cannot compose music, but they are still, oh, it's an artist. But the talented people, if they are told that they are a genius, it's quite offensive, because they do have a talent, and they are suffering and struggling towards a goal. And when you're being told that you have a God-given gift, it's hard to.
So perhaps in your way of thinking, then it would mostly be ascribed to their hard work, or at least how well they could accumulate knowledge, and then only perhaps a tiny proportion would be some kind of natural gift, perhaps.
Yeah. Yes. I have the same conclusion as Socrates has in one of his dialogues, that there is something that is, as they call it, God-given, but something that you get from birth. I have strong belief in biological factors, that someone really have a talent for something, but it doesn't end there. If you don't work hard enough, and you just have the talent, and you do not put an effort in it, and you do not work, and you do not get the right education, then you don't reach as far.
For I'll tell you, my personal experience is as being a composer in particular. I have learned. My teacher taught me how to compose in a traditional manner, or at least quasi-traditional, using harmonies and so on. And I continued through this path throughout the years. And into university, I quickly discovered that everyone studying composition was not writing the way that I was. They were all writing very modernist and experimental music. In fact, there's a course in Sydney called experimental music, I think it was called. So basically, they would not make music. They would make dramatic performances, artistic shows. They might go onto the stage not wearing anything, for instance, and call it music. So that was one side, and I realized very quickly that if I wanted to be accepted by these people, I would have to write in that style. And I suppose for me, just ethically, I couldn't do it. For I think a lot of other people, they don't want to do it, but they are forced to, or they're encouraged to, and then they might branch off again. I think the natural instinct from my experience is that people do want to compose music that's beautiful, and then they get molded out of that way of thinking through universities. And that's why I think that this is a problem throughout university and in the art school as well, of course, that people get molded into this way of thinking about their personal expression. And if their music doesn't have that personal expression because it sounds too much like one of the old masters, sounds too much like Beethoven or Mozart, then it's criticized and it's not worthy because that's already been done. So is that what you found as well in Norway, perhaps?
Yeah, or that's at least what I've heard. I've not attended any art schools myself. I've just played the piano at a piano school, but that I've never taken it to university level. So it's just basic, having a piano teacher, and then you are not as much. Then you don't face the ideology that much.
Okay.
So, but I've definitely there are so many examples here in Norway too. People are not accepted even to art schools here in Norway if they paint in a classical way. They would be really talented. And also in architecture, it's actually a good friend of mine. He wanted to draw classical buildings, and when at architecture school, and this was in Copenhagen, I think, and he knew that he would fail class or fail the final exam if he handed in his project as a classical building. But what he did is that he is a homosexual. So he thought, I will play their game. So because they had an ideology, he used his ideology and put the project in a pride setting or something, that he said, due to my sexuality and pride and everything, I want to be colorful and I want to be playful, and that is what I'm expressing in this piece. So they couldn't fail him, although they wanted to. So that was his way through the education, because he would have failed. It's really run by ideology. But I'm curious, how did you go through the education?
Well, I didn't study composition. In fact, when I took the interview to study composition, I quickly realized that it was not for me. And that's why I chose to study performance instead. So, and I think all performers, by nature of them playing old music, we're more like craftsmen. We're trying to create connections with our audience. To limited degrees for some people. I think a lot of people are more interested in ego and self-expression and what they can do. whereas I was more interested in what the listener would actually feel when I played my music, because I could see the difference. I play in church as well, and I can see that when I play a certain way, people feel more invited to pray. But if you play something more dissonant and harsh, then they get up and leave. So it's a common experience to see and look, empirically, to watch what people's response is, and then judge what works and what doesn't work, for instance. So that was how I came to my conclusions, basically. But I don't think that the performance departments, especially I think in piano, they don't really teach a very good idea of this. They're more interested in the personalities of the composers. Being note perfect is a big problem. The obsession with accuracy to the text, to the score, rather than the actual audible result of the performance. And some talk about expression. Personally, I think it's a different issue when we talk about performative expression compared to the craft of the composing itself. I think there has to be an engaging way of performing so that the listener is, actually gripping something. I think C.P.E. Bach's son, said that to persuade the audience and make them emotionally moved, you have to be also feeling that way. And I think that at least giving the impression that you're feeling that way as a way to interact with the audience, then which doesn't fully get taught at the conservatorium enough. And I think that's a common problem throughout many different schools. So much emphasis now, because of modernism, I think, has fallen onto the exactitude of following the composer's instructions. And that's sort of I think it's come from Kant as well, because it's become a worship of the composer taking precedence over the product itself. And so if the composer told you to do this, then you must do it. And then if you try to do something else, then it's not authentic anymore. It's not the authentic expression of that composer's genius, I suppose. That's been my experience anyway.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to talk about Beethoven for a moment, because he's someone I'm trying to understand within this way of thinking. So I suppose Kant came up with the idea of genius in the late 18th century, and then his ideas were fluctuating around the time of Beethoven. And especially after the time of Beethoven, people came to view him as sort of the musical prototype of the musical genius. I think Wagner talked about Beethoven moving music beyond just the pure beautiful to something sublime. That was his word, sublime. But genius would be another word, something mystical anyway, that was inexpressible. And when you listen to Beethoven, I think people all know, without having to think about it much, that you can hear the difference between him and the people who came before him, the Mozart and Bach and so on. There's something that's changed in the aesthetic quality of it. And Beethoven himself was, known to be expressing, if not himself, expressing human values, like heroic values and human struggles at the core. And I wanted to see whether that has had a positive effect on music or a negative, because as we know, the Romantic era has produced some of the greatest and most ambitious and most emotional music of all time. But at the same time, it's sort of come out of an ideology that is sort of mystical. And I want to see what you think about that.
Yeah, what I think is that, and here you must arrest me if I say something wrong about Beethoven or something. You know that better than I do. And he was definitely praised as this genius. I have his mask on the wall here with this with this crown almost on his head. So he was very much like the Napoleon. And what I've understood is that he brought something new into music or into composing. He dared to break the rules. And that is how it has been told, at least as I've read. And I don't think it's that Beethoven brought something negative in, but perhaps the way it has been interpreted and taken further. So at every period, if it's like we talked earlier about that originality should not be a value in itself. I think we did, and because then it loses the focus on craft. It's originality or self-expression, but that doesn't mean that bringing in something new is always bad, as long as it has in mind of improving music for the audience, or making a better piece of music that expresses something universal. If you then have to break the so-called rules, then that's perfectly fine. I've never understood why the rules are regarded as something unbreakable, because when it comes to the different art forms, rules are nothing more than good guidelines.
Conventions.
Yes.
So when we talk about, the values of timeless values, we're not talking about a list of rules like the Ten Commandments, but we're talking about the actual result of what the craft really does for the audience.
Yeah. And then, definitely. And then when maybe the composing had become too rigid in a way, and then it was necessary to break it up a little. And then instead of trying to follow that ideal, I don't know if that was the ideal of Beethoven, but I think it was, because at least I've not heard him talk very much about being proud of being so original. He was proud of being a master of making fantastic music. And that is supposed to be the point, whether you follow the rules and you really master the rules or the guidelines, or if you have to break them up a little. And I think you can see the same in all different art forms, painting as well. There was a reason why the modernist movement began, because painting had become too mass-produced almost. You knew that you were supposed to paint that way. Everything was looking the same, and they were simple. I'm of course exaggerating, and then they needed to break it up a little to make it better, to express something universally human in a more compelling way or a more convincing way. But then it was taken too far, because then people misinterpreted and was like, oh, this is new, and that is a value in itself.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. So Beethoven introduces what we might call, perhaps in all of the history of music, perhaps Beethoven most directly creates something truly new. And then the assumption is then, then new is the desirable product here, not what he was actually trying to achieve. And it didn't take off in music so much for another century or so. The Romantics were all, of course, breaking rules. They quickly dismantled sonata form, for instance, and they redefined the orchestra, expanded its numbers. Lots of things changed. The opera, of course, also changed dramatically. But what didn't really change until the early 20th century was the harmony, the sort of underlying way of using harmony, and then the ultimate negation of it. So it's interesting in that way. It's been described before that music often follows behind the other art forms in its sort of stages of where it progresses. like the modernists come in the late 19th century, and then music takes another 20 or 30 years to get to that same stage. I'm not sure if there's a reason for that, unless it's to do with music being harder to understand than the other art forms. I'm not sure. Have you heard about this before?
Yes, I've heard about it and thought about what the reason could be. I'm not certain. It might be that it has more of a popularity to it. So although I definitely see your point from a philosophical point of view, it's really hard to talk about music, but it's still something that is really popular among human beings. You can pick out very few people who doesn't like music or don't care about music, but there are several people who don't care very much about painting or about sculpture or poetry. That's almost dead in these days. And but music is something that is something that people have a personal connection to. And although that's a newer form of craft, the movie business, they try to modernize that as well with the Buñuel and other modernist movie makers. But that's also very popular, and it didn't. It was no hit.
The experimental side of film never really took off, did it? I mean, it's had a, you know, it's still got an underground following, but I think with film, it's just got such a inherent need for mass appeal because it's so such a commodity. You know, it's so expensive to make that the cost itself sort of pushes back at the experimentalists and just tries to tell compelling human stories. Now, whether it does original and interesting stories is you know, a bit more rare, but and that can be a problem. But at the same time, yeah, it seems to tend towards more universal storytelling, and perhaps art has lost its universality because the lack of interest, or perhaps because there was a disconnect between the public and the artists themselves.
Yeah, and that has also been an ideal for. Now we go back to Immanuel Kant again, because his aesthetic philosophy was that it was supposed to be disinterested, because if not, it was not pure enough, and it was something. Yeah, I would say dirty in a way, something closer to, again, craft. He often used the example of, if you see a painting of food and you're hungry and you like the painting because of that, then it's not a good judgment. It's not a then it's not a good judgment of that painting. And of course, that is like, well, sure, but if you manage to paint something that made someone hungry, that is pretty well done. And if you compare that to the ideals of the ancient the Greeks, where they have this story. I don't remember the name of the painter again, but he was supposed. It's not Apelles, but another one. He was supposed to be the greatest in his age, and they had this competition of who could paint the grapes more beautiful, and then at one of them the bird comes over and eats and tries to eat at the grape, and it's like, wow, that's so impressive. And then the other one has, and they have this blanket over the painting, and if I remember the story correctly, the blanket is also painted. So then he tricks all of them, and it's like, wow, you were so talented. And I think it has something to do with that it's supposed to be Kant and many other philosophers were so obsessed with truth. And of course, you should strive towards truth, but if it becomes this obsession with absolute truth, then you find that trickstering, as the Greek stories, then you find that to be immoral or something. And then you're not supposed to trick people like that, or you're not supposed to appeal to the senses.
But it seems that he confuses two categories, because in science we seek truth, but in art we seek expression, don't we? But perhaps in his search for something objective, he finds that people's emotional response to something sort of devalues it in a way.
Yeah. And and that can be tied to the moral philosophy, because many, even when we read it today, many of the Greek stories, it's they had such a different view on many things. So many different views. The man who falls in love with the statue and try to have intercourse with the female statue, and that's supposed to be the compliment for the sculptor. And even today, when we read it, it's that was extreme, but it just shows the different the respect for the craftsman without making him into something that that you don't understand.
And if it turned out that it was not, say a painting wasn't painted by that person, but by his student, it wouldn't matter to our judgment of it either.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that the divide then between the modernists and people like us is really where you center your attention, whether you center it on the work itself or on the sort of imagined mediary between you and the person trying to tell you the story. And that makes sense in the sense that, we're trying to understand each other and we're trying to build a connection there. But then you miss the point of why it was being done in the first place. It was trying to, an artwork should be telling the story itself. You don't need that sort of second man to do it for you.
Yeah, and then also if it's I think Aristotle has a good division between different forms of knowledge, and the one is craft, technique, and the other one is phronesis, and there's five more, but to take just those two. And phronesis is the moral knowledge, and that is the goal of phronesis is the act itself. The knowledge about being moral, being kind, is to be kind. That's the goal, the act itself. And the goal of craft is, as we said, the product. But then if you make the goal of being an artist or being a painter or a sculptor, the act itself, then it becomes an expression of something moral. And you can see traces from that it's supposed to be, they often drag in elements from moral without calling it moral philosophy.
So let's talk more about Aristotle and his idea of mimesis then.
Yeah.
So can you just briefly explain to the audience what this is, what this idea is?
Yeah, it's mimesis is usually translated with imitation. I think representation is a better word, and that is defined as one of the goals of poetry and painting, for instance, to represent something. And then there has been, through history, the way it has been interpreted, it can be divided into two parts, I would say. The one that says that it's representing something on the surface. It's representing the surface of something, or it's representing the inner story of something.
So it's the art that is doing the representation in this case, a piece of art.
Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. And that can be, and you can see that from the early Romantic movement that you talked about, that was at a time when they started interpreting Aristotle's view on mimesis as representing something other than or something deeper than the surface. But then you start moving into the mystical, because, well, what is that? And so to go back to the why he calls it the purpose of you can say art, but as the purpose of the poetry or painting, is that he says that the goal or the feeling that humans enjoy with seeing a painting or reading poetry is recognition. And I think, and that is of course recognizing something that has been represented, mimesis. And I think some people have interpreted that very simplistic, to think that Aristotle thought that if you saw a painting of a cow and you recognized it, that is the joy. But he was a smart man. He definitely didn't mean that at all. It was recognizing either an emotion, a relationship. You see a painting of a loving couple that are in love, and you recognize that feeling. You recognize it from the way it has been expressed in, or not expressed, but represented in that painting. And to take music, I've tried to formulate something about music, although that's harder, I would say. But I would say that music doesn't represent necessarily, it can do it, but it doesn't necessarily represent a story or a message. It can be used as that, but I think the best kind of music, or music at its best, represents a belief that and that doesn't have to be religious belief, but a belief in some kind of existence, or in a memory, or in a feeling, self-worth, something. It's not directed, music or the perception of music is not directed outwards towards an object, but directed inwards. I would say inspired again by Brentano. And now I'm off on some tangent here. I'm sorry about that.
No, absolutely. Because let's go with that idea, because I think it's really important. I think philosophers, like we've all struggled to try and understand music. I think Kant himself came up with some of his theories because he couldn't understand how music fit into the picture. It's the only art form that doesn't have a direct connection or direct representation of reality. So it cannot be, it's sort of missing that intermediary of what you would call recognition. And so instead, you're recognizing something on a more emotional level, or on a more, I don't want to say spiritual level, but yeah, it's tricky to explain, isn't it? Like you said, it represents a belief of a kind. And it's something that I think we can feel when we listen to music, that we're engaging and we're recognizing some core value or core part of the world. but to try and explain it in words is almost impossible. And that might be why philosophers struggle to talk about it, because at one point, I think with music, you sort of just have to, raise your hands and just, give up on trying to define it and just come up with a very, very simple explanation that makes sense. If you overcomplicate the theory, it becomes confusing again. What do you think?
I've been thinking about it much before this conversation, and I definitely understand why so much philosophy of music is wrapped into vague concepts, very vague, such as the language of the angels or the connection to the soul, or something very vague. And it's all right to use words like that if you try to explain it. For instance, some people think that the word universal is very vague, but then you can try to explain it as being something that is common to people across times, across cultures, and try to get closer to what that source is. But then it's usually not the same with the philosophy of music, those vague words. So as I mentioned, the closest I got was that it has something to do with it's representing or appealing to our beliefs. That's why it's much used in religious practices, music, and also why it evokes a lot of emotion. And I was inspired, as I said, by Brentano on this, and I can try to explain the reason why, the reasoning behind it, while not being too long. But all perception is on every art form, such as painting, sculpture, even the art of cooking when tasting something, or the art of perfume when smelling something. Everyone is perceived as being directed towards an object. You could say that music is also directed towards an object in the sense of waves in the air, but it's not perceived as being that. And so then Brentano calls it, or he suggests that it is inner perception, that you perceive inwards. And he says it's the same kind of perception that you have for confirming the existence of something. So he says that empirical knowledge is the basis. You should base everything on empirical knowledge, what you can see, what you can observe, perceive, everything. But there has to be some kind of belief that what you perceive is real. And the fact that you sense something actually proves that you exist. Just those very basic questions. And that confirmation, he says, the process of getting that confirmation that we usually do every day, we usually think that we exist and that people around us and things around us exist, that is also inner perception. So that is, I think that music can play on that, not necessarily that very existential that I just described, but that it has something to do with beliefs. the belief in friendship, the belief in something spiritual, or that it or a belief in a memory. It could be very different kinds of belief, but something that is very rooted in your existence. You could call it personal, or something very rooted in yourself. And that is also why, or that could explain why music is so universally appreciated all over the globe.
Absolutely. And in many different forms, but it seems that today it's really, perhaps through globalization, it's become a westernized form of music that has sort of captured the imagination of the entire world now. And I wonder whether, I don't want to say there's something universal about a Western music per se, but perhaps about the tools that are used by Western music and the way that we perceive time and, and sound. The other problem with music is that we don't have sort of the outlier test subject. I mean, everyone grows up from a young age listening to music. And so, let's say I was a skeptic, I would say that, oh, these aren't really, the music is not directly the feeling, it's been taught to you by your culture. What do you think about that as a criticism?
I have a perfect example. I've heard so many times people saying something like that, and especially when it comes to classical music. And of course, culture could have an impact. I don't think we would have listened to pop music if we were not raised in this time, or that people in general are listening to pop music if we didn't live in this time. So culture and the uprising can definitely have an impact. But if you talk about classical music, that is supposed, or I believe that is more closer to something universal, something that is common across cultures, across ages. And I've had so many friends that I've asked with me on at the opera, at the ballet, and many of them have the same answer. They are trying to be polite and say, "Well, I've never been exposed to it before, and it's not my generation. Or I don't know anything about it. It's old-fashioned. It's something." They always blame it on that they don't know enough about it. But then I had a good friend of mine from Uganda visiting, and they do not have opera house or a ballet house in Uganda. I asked him, and he was like, "No, I've never heard of it." He had never heard of Beethoven, of Tchaikovsky. It was not his culture. And he stayed at my place for 10 days or something, so we needed to find something to do. And I had tickets to Swan Lake in the opera. And I said, "Do you want to join me at the opera house?" "Yeah, sure." He didn't know anything about it. And he was the most excited guest I've ever brought to the opera. He had never heard about Tchaikovsky. He had never heard about the story, and he was amazed by the music. And it was not some kind of politeness, because he, as many Africans are very direct. He was very direct, and what he didn't like, he said, I don't like it." And if he liked something, he said it. So it was not some kind of politeness. He was so excited, and he ran back to the opera after the break, and to see whether the princess would get the prince. And he was amazed at dancing. He was amazed at music playing, and yeah. So to me, that was a very good example that, if not proved, it at least showed that culture can have an effect, but not the way that people usually say that it has. Because I think the culture has an effect on my friends who said, no, it's old-fashioned, I don't know anything about it. They have been affected by culture to not regard it as something relevant to them. But someone who has not been exposed to it, has never heard of it, don't have any prejudices towards it, I think it has very much potential to appeal to them because of the universality of the music.
That's right. So a lot of people from our culture may view opera as, not of their class or their time, or their who they are, and then they use that to not engage with it. I've got the opposite case actually, personally, because I, as well as being a great lover of Western music, at the conservatorium where I studied, and then later I learned about the Balinese Gamelan, which is from Indonesia. And I ended up traveling to Indonesia, going to Bali, and hearing them play the gamelan. So it's a set of metal percussion instruments, and they form an orchestra. And I was just completely blown away and amazed at how beautiful it is. I actually discovered through that there is, in Bali, like in many traditions now, there's sort of a clash between the traditionalists and the modernists, who want to, the Beethovens of their ensembles now, bringing in new things and being experimental. And then there are others which are, there are pieces of music which are hundreds of years old, have been memorized all this time and brought to the modern day. And I personally enjoy those more. Perhaps I think they're more timeless. They certainly have a more noble quality to them than the modern music, which is more about show. It's more about about showing off. So that's just been an experience of mine. That it really does transcend cultures, and I think you can allow culture to get in the way more than it gets in the way. I guess ideologically more than it does just orally in itself. So there's an example of that too. So it works both ways.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about Beethoven again, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Not that look, personally, I don't like Beethoven very much, but I'm more interested in his music. But I did want to talk about where his ideas led in particular. From what I've understood, I think, and you may agree, that the Romantic era in art, in music, was generally a high point in culture, despite the fact that the element of genius and the ways of thinking were becoming more and more mystical rather than empirical. So I wanted to know about that. It seems to be quite an unusual time to be in, because there is this idea that's emerging, but at the same time, the expressive capabilities of the orchestra, for example, are more than they've ever been. So why does it sort of converge at that point, do you think, rather than perhaps before this ideology?
So why it happened during the Romantic time rather than before? That's a good question. What I've understood is that it had something to do with that it, at least parts of it, can be traced back to the fact that the composer, the painter, the sculptor wanted to be regarded as something more than a craftsman, and wanted to raise their status. And the way to do that was to find out what or to find what they thought of as being the fine arts and then group them together and call it for art. And then came all these ideas that we have been talking about the all those romantic ideas that became more and more mystical. And I think it was still a high point because they had so much good luggage with them from the past that it took some time for the decline to start. But I'm really not certain why it, I'm not sure why it started in the Romantic or right before.
Well, I think from what you're saying then, that the composers of that era, the artists, they all had that solid foundation of craftsmanship, which they were then trying to elevate and improve. Improve in the sense of improve their craft, but also raise the status of what they were doing. And the way to do that was to create works that were, I suppose, beyond mere expressions, but something that was trying to be, I suppose, even more than that.
Yeah. Or there is one possible explanation, not a complete one, but one of them. And although I regard myself as quite an individualist, it was also the belief in the individual became much stronger right before the Romantic era, and that can explain parts of why the craftsman wanted to raise above being a craftsman, because he was so unique as an individual. And as you mentioned earlier, that it wasn't, in other times, it was not common to sign your painting. And it was not necessarily common, just the way that it's not common to sign your house when being an architect, because it's more regarded as, or at least traditional architecture is regarded as a craft, and that can be traced to the egocentrism. And I don't mean to talk down egoism or individualism, but there is a difference between being concerned about the individual and being too much concerned about the individual, or to ignore, or to focus on it in aspects where it's not that relevant.
So it's really about having a balance between knowing your individual capacity and wanting to rise above, I suppose, but then also having that foundation underneath it.
Yeah, and it can be compared to what you said earlier about how Immanuel Kant mixed in moral philosophy in a place where it didn't belong, in aesthetics, or tried to make an explanation of something that he didn't understand. And it's somewhat similar in the way of mixing in individual rights that is more of a politics issue, or a more of an existential issue, a more modern term, self-worth, but to mix that into craftsmanship and to places where it doesn't belong, then it can go the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. Something else that's interesting about the Romantic era is because of perhaps this emphasis on individuality, the consequence of that is actually the diminishing of the group. And this was, so what I mean by this is that composers started to regulate a lot more clearly what they wanted the piece to be. So they would write in the expression marks a lot more. They would write in tempo markings, metronome markings, to be that exact. And for the orchestra, it started to be viewed as sort of a well-oiled machine. And so on the one hand, you have this great expression and ideal of the genius, the composer, while the orchestra is relegated originally from being interpreters down to a role which is nothing more than just like a phonograph, like a MP3 performance of the composer's vision. And I've always found that interesting, that at the same time that freedom and individuality was so expressed, that at the same time it would have the opposite effect on what orchestras were becoming. That's one of the reasons I really like playing music from before the Romantic era, especially as an organist, because you go further back and you just have more and more freedom. You can choose what sounds you want to make, and you can choose the tempos, the speeds, you may even want to change the notes. And especially with that, one of the beauties of the historical performance movement, which has really emerged as a reaction to the modernist way of thinking, is that they've emphasized freedom again and allowed performers to interpret the music in their own way. And I wanted to know how this, whether this ties itself back into a mystical way of thinking, or whether it's trying to return to craftsmanship. I think there's a bit of both in there.
Yeah, I didn't know about that. That it was this historical movement and the amount of freedom. I knew that it was a certain degree of more freedom, but not that amount. I'm just curious, because before continuing on that, do you play slower than what is common, or do you prefer to play it faster?
Generally, I'm not sure. I find that too fast leaves the listener behind in a way. I think my wife has been good at telling me that I need to slow down at times when I perform, because of that exact reason, because you may be left behind. But I wouldn't say that I'm a slow performer by any measure. And then, of course, as a performer, you get nervous and you play faster. Yeah. This is one reason. The historical performance movement is one reason why I'm more optimistic, perhaps, about the way things are going. I know that it's pretty bad on the whole, but they've had a problem in their movement with textual authenticity. So while they talk about the freedom of music and our performances of it, they're really still obsessed, like modernists, with the score. The fact that it should be the score, the manuscript, whatever, the earliest source of the piece of music should be the one that we should be reading from and performing from. And forgetting the notion, which is that, in the Baroque era, these were not thought of artworks. They weren't really thought of pieces of music at all. They were thought of, just something that was played, perhaps improvised, and then maybe played once and never played again. And so what we really have are not artworks in the modern sense in music scores, but we have rather what you might call fossils or fragments of a performing tradition that we don't have anymore. And so on the one hand, we're bringing back freedom, which is a great thing. We're bringing back improvisation, which is a very, very important part of bringing back the direct connection to the listener, which is, of course, what jazz does really well. People responding to the audience and improvising on the spot. It's something that most classical performers are very terrified to even think about doing. Also because it contains a strong element of craft. I mean, you cannot get good at improvising unless you study it over and over and over again. And then on the other hand, there's this problem of the textual integrity and authenticity, which gets in the way because it's a sort of an anachronistic misunderstanding of what music should be, what music was in that time, which was mostly improvised or done a lot more free. So I'm not sure if you've heard about any of that before, but that's a little taste into.
Yeah, I've not to that degree, no. But it's definitely an interesting question, whether that is moving towards the more mystical or more towards craft. I'm not certain.
Go on. Yeah. Well, my strong belief is that performers should also be composers, because in the act of composing, you learn so much about what goes into a piece of music and then what makes it engaging. And I think that the fact that this has been lost, that most performers are not composers, has really, it's created a large gap in our knowledge, I think, in our way of understanding music. So
I would say that it's it sounds like it's two different kinds of craft that can be equally valued. I draw the parallel with the American Indians, who did not want to write down their stories because they wanted the storyteller to put it into your phrasing, to be the composer or to be the author as well. So the storyteller, when telling an oral story that has gone through generation, they have to keep the essence of the story and they have to bring it further, keep the tradition, the craftsmanship, and carry it on. But still, the storyteller gets a larger role than when reading from a book that an author has written, because then you have to read each single word. And I would say they are both very valuable. And of course, the value of the written piece, whether it's musical sheets on a paper or letters, is that you can keep it as it was, and it can and you don't risk, or you don't face the same amount of risk of it being lost, but then you lose that element of becoming the composer or the storyteller yourself, and then also engaging more in it, or at least having potential of engaging more in it.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a positive side to both of them, in that you don't, an artist wants to preserve their work, especially if it timeless work, of course. But then on the other hand, there's a risk of losing the freedom. Now, this is something I wanted to mention before, but I forgot, which is definitely that music does have these two aspects, which we've kept talking about. There's the composing part, and then there's the performance. And they're two completely separate parts of the creative process, I'd say. With composition, it's a common idea with romantics and people who believe in individuality and expression, that the composer is feeling the emotions of the piece when he writes it. But this is not true. This is often not true, because a composer can easily not be personally invested in the work, but they're still trying to convey an emotion or an ideal without having to put themselves into the work, so to speak. Whereas with performance, it's a very different experience, because with performance, you're trying to, I suppose, tell a story directly. And in this case, the composer sort of takes the back seat. And now the performer is at the center of all performances, because that's what the listener is there to listen to. No one is there looking at the composer and looking at the score. They're listening to the music. And so these are two very, very different aspects. I think that an ideal was built up, especially with Beethoven, that composers are not composing genuinely unless they're composing with their heart and that they're, putting themselves into their work. But you would know that this is not the case.
Yeah, and I think that as far back as I've traced it is to Horace, the ancient writer Horace, and his work Ars Poetica was extremely influential. And there is one phrase from Ars Poetica. I don't remember it literally, but it says something similar, that if you're writing something sad, you have to cry as well. Because he writes about how to write good poetry. And I think that is giving Horace too little credit. Because as I read his work, Ars Poetica, as a whole, in the complete work, I don't see any other traces of that striving towards having to have your heart in when doing something. I think what he means is, and this is just a personal analysis, not something historical looking at hundreds of sources, but just from reading the work, I think what he means is that to write well, you need empathy. You need to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes. You need to be able to, if you're writing something sad, either poetry or some melancholic music, you need to know how it is to cry, to be sad, but not that you have to do it right then and there, that you have to feel it there. And it can be to remember something really, really sad that you experienced and find what would have been the best comfort for me when I lost my dear friend. It would have been to hear these words or to hear these harmonies.
Yeah.
And that is just good craftsmanship, not something mystical of that you need your emotions in it or something. Although it's because that is easily misunderstood. It doesn't mean that you should not have feelings when composing. That's not the point. But it's just that's not necessary. Can have it, and many people have it, but it's not necessary to compose well.
Absolutely, yes. So I think in a way, as a craft or as a skill, you're putting those feelings onto the page on a novel, or as a composer, you're writing out the music, or for an artist, they're painting it onto the scene, and then the emotions are in the work. I think the same thing is true of music. The only problem with music, of course, is that the music doesn't play itself. And I think that's the reason why performers have to play out the emotions. They have to, or at least not cry themselves, but they themselves also have to deliver that emotional performance to the listener. They couldn't just stand up and just play the notes and not act as though it means anything. It has to still have that meaning, just like in the painting, someone may be looking happy and joyful, and it's a joyful scene. They're not just looking bored and out of place. So I think that's the role of the performer. They're like someone in an artwork in that way.
Yeah, but then there are different views on how to express that when performing. I know that the Russian school of music is that every feeling you express in your face or your body goes weakens the expressions in your fingers when you play the piano. So all feelings are supposed to come out through the fingers, and you can see that on so many Russian Heifetz or some other violinist or pianists or.
It's very interesting. Yeah. There's sort of on some schools, I think there's an emphasis that you should not be the center of attention, but the composer should be, the performance should be the center of attention. But then on other cases, people think that it's actually really quite beneficial to play out the emotions of the piece as well as you can, or at least show that you're engaged. I think that there's an argument for, I think I tend towards the latter. In fact, as an organist, you may know that most organs, at least the consoles where people sit, they're completely invisible to the audience because they're up high or behind something. And so there's nothing of that. And then in that instance, you're challenged to present all of the feeling directly through the sound. You can't rely on that emotional clutch that, violinists so love to use, with the way they play with so much expression. But of course, with my channel, I've wanted to keep that element, and that's why we film me playing rather than just still images of beautiful churches and things. Yeah. Let's also talk politics just for a moment.
Okay.
Because I think this ties in. It ties in a lot to our discussion about the state of art today. Often it's assumed that the quality and the appreciation of art will increase with more government funding, for instance. Do you think that classical art needs more public funding?
I don't think that the cultural life becomes better with government funding as a whole. But of course, if you pick out certain projects, of course, with government funding, it could be produced. It could be good opera productions, something like that. But I definitely don't think that culture as a whole should be something that is remote from having to earn money or having to earn. It sounds so cold, unfortunately, to say having to earn money, but it all amounts to having to earn appreciation, because that is what I think makes the culture grow, is that you have to make something that is appreciated. And of course, that could be taken too far in certain industries. You can see the movie industry, it could be taken too far with the following up number 4, 5, 6 of the same concept. But still, it's produced so many masterpieces within the movie industry without governmental funding. And you can see so many traces of, or so many fields within culture that is wholly financed by government, that is really declining, that is really not doing well. And I think that it has to do with when the government entered financing culture. It was because we have to save these fine arts that do not survive by themselves.
About protection.
Yes. And the thought itself is not necessarily that bad, but when that becomes the ideal for so many years, and it becomes the ideal without being questioned, then something is financed if it is unpopular enough. If something is really, really unpopular, then you are worthy of earning the taxpayers' money. But if it's popular, and if it's of, and many things that are popular, not everything, but many things that are popular are of high quality. So if it's of high quality and popular, then you don't deserve the taxpayers' money.
Right. And if the government's funding it, then you're admitting defeat, that you can't get the money yourself.
Yeah.
But there is of course some counterexamples to this as well, aren't there? Because, for example, opera, it's known that in opera in Australia, it's never survived without government funding. The same would go for our symphony orchestra as well. So if we didn't have government funding, we would only be able to have limited opera seasons, maybe for a month or so per year, and then that would be it, and it would not be financially viable for the rest of the year. And the problem with that would be that we'd lose a lot of variety. So in a way, there is a benefit to it, right?
Yeah, and I can see that, although it's also a bit hard to use those examples, because when the culture or society has become dependent on those fundings from the government, then they do not manage to lose it. So it becomes this vicious circle, instead of having that you have to really produce something that the audience want to come and watch, and you have to strive towards getting funding from private funding, and then it suddenly becomes more in the larger image. It's then cultural life suddenly become more independent. It can stand on its own legs in a way, and it doesn't need a walking stick. And I actually heard, I haven't managed to find the source of that, but I have heard from my grandmother. She told me that there was an opera house in Australia that almost was bankrupt, and then it got a new director. I think this was in the 70s or something. Maybe it's just a rumor, but I think it would have been true. And then it got a new director, and he or she said, okay, we're just putting up or just performing Swan Lake, La Boheme, Rigoletto, all the classics that everyone are like, oh, but we have heard it 10 times before. But that's what people want to see. And then it suddenly, it was a large success, and it survived, and it became so, it was one of the most successful in the country, I heard. And I think when it has become so separated that it's just to use one example, because we have here in Norway, it's everything is governmentally funded, like of culture. And at the Philharmonic, the Oslo Philharmonic Orchestra, they had just got a Russian conductor, very talented, and he performed he conducted Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1, which is, I've heard, the most played piano concerto in the world. And the Philharmonic Orchestra had not played it in more than 20 years. And the Russians are so cultured. So he said, I've never, ever have experienced an orchestra that has not played Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto in 20 years. They usually play it every year. Every time I suggest to play it, they're like, oh, again, because, but they enjoy it because it's a fun piece to play. But he said, I'm shocked. And the reason for that is governmental funding, because they're supposed to not do what is commercial. And that is regarded as commercial just because it is popular. And Tchaikovsky is one of my great favorites. So I'm one of those who suffers from being from living in a society where the culture is governmentally funded, because it's only new productions of modernistic atonal music, something that is unpopular, something that is not commercial, which means in many cases popular and of high quality.
That's really interesting to get a different perspective about this, because it's quite different in Australia. I think we might have our government might have more of a pragmatic approach when it comes to the things that they fund. We're very much a sporting culture, and so we're really and sport, of course, has gone long beyond its original intention of physically training people, and now it's televised and commercialized and everything. Well, the same thing they think about with music. In fact, that our opera companies have actually been criticized by my fellow musicians, because over the years, in the last 20 years, let's say, they've slowly shrunk their repertoire of operas down to the famous top 10 now. And it's been very upsetting for, it's a balance you have to play between the regular goers who want to see something new for once, rather than, come back to the same La Boheme again and, all the Verdi operas. And then with people who've never been to an opera before, and you want to deliver them a really, really great product. And so there's a tension there that I think, I'm not sure where it will end, but it doesn't really point to a very healthy opera company when they've reduced their opera productions down to 5 or 6 famous works. So I think that's the other side of what it could be, what can happen. Our opera companies are partially funded, I think, government funded, and then the other half would be private patronage. So there's a balance there between what the patrons want and what the government wants to contribute in the interests of financial benefit. The opera companies have to release reports where they talk about, the profits they've made or the losses, and then the government, steps in to try and, they're sort of like the watchdog saying, okay, we'll fund you, but to what extent? We can't just give you all the money. So a bit more of a pragmatic approach there. One of the tragic things, I think, which has happened, is that progressively now, and I can see this happening into the future, the Sydney Opera House, which has been, the mainstay of fantastic opera productions, is starting to move towards music theatre, musicals, and also towards a venue for talks, and comedians, rather than its original intention as an opera house. And I think that's because of the continuous losses and government prop-ups of the opera companies, whereas a comedian will sell out easily. And yeah, it's a real problem, actually. Look, if the symphony orchestras were to fall apart tomorrow, I wouldn't shed a tear, but I would, because look, I do think that they're not very musical. Like the music they play is wonderful, but they often do not deliver, because they're, I don't know if you know orchestral players, but their heart is not in it anymore. It's just a job for them, and at that point, they don't have the connection. They don't want to be convincing the audience and taking them on a journey. For them, it's now just a 2-hour call, and then they're going to the pub afterwards, drinking with their friends. So I wouldn't shed a tear for that, but it is concerning that for an art form that we so highly value, that it cannot survive financially in the current political system and the current culture. It makes me wonder also about the way that funding used to work in the in the 18th century, for example, which was all patronage and monarchy. And you wonder whether in a time when wealth was concentrated in the hands of the monarchs, whether that was a better time for artists, at least craftsmen. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there are some benefits of having private sponsors that sponsor something solely themselves, because then it's a different kind of commercialism. It's a different kind of being commercial. The one thing is to sell as many tickets. I don't disregard that at all, but then you can fall into that trap of having to put up a comedian and everything like that. But then again, when there is one private patron, then many exciting things can happen, because then some really interesting performances can be put up in both directions, in bad directions according to me, but also in really exciting directions. And I've seen that in the States, for instance, in New York, where they have these private patrons that decide to put up plays that haven't been or operas or ballets that, like, what, I haven't seen I thought that wasn't popular anymore, but this one rich guy really loved that performance, and he gets all the his name at first, like, oh, we want to thank this and this person for donating to us and everything. And I think that can create a lot of exciting opportunities. Not necessarily that it is the best system, or that it is something that works solely by itself. I think most things can be exaggerated, and I guess that as well. But I think it is important also for current or for present societies to encourage that to be a part, or to encourage patrons to become a part of cultural life. I don't think it should be disregarded, because it opens a lot of opportunities. There is something interesting with one person being able to decide something, instead of this panel with people who have been decided by the government or picked out by the government. All of them have the same education. They've gone through the machinery, and they think all the same. And then the commercial aspect that might fall into the trap. But then you have this one individual that can pick out something and make some, it can put some spice on the cultural life, I think.
Absolutely, and we do have the freedom, of course, today to fund whatever we want, really.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important thing, and that, yes, that we should encourage patronage. It's strong in America, not very strong in Australia. I think I think the problem that also with government is that people don't stop assuming that they need to contribute, because it's in their tax, and the government's already chosen and looking for these talents, and not realizing, of course, that the ideology that guides a government institution of art is going to be very different to what the private market may want. I've talked about the funding of opera in Australia, but of course that's only one small part. They're always issuing out grants to people for various reasons. They may just say, 1 year that they're only going to accept women, for example, as for their artwork or something like that. And so there's you could call it discrimination if you wanted, but it's also obviously it's an ideology that's guiding the search for art rather than a search for quality, which can come from anyone, can come from anywhere. I think we're getting towards the end, but I've really appreciated this talk. I think I have a few more just little questions that I need to throw at you before we finish up here. Yeah. First,
and I also have one question for you, but you can start first.
Sure. So one question is just quickly about the ethics that go into an artwork. We talk about valuing the craft for itself. I just wanted to ask you if an artwork is created unethically, by either slave labor or some kind of false political ideology or even a religious one, can you still appreciate the work of art?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's crucial. That's one of the exam questions. If you are between the craft or the act, what is the goal? And if the craft, or not if the product of a craft is the goal, then the act should not have any significance. It can create fascination from the way it was created. It can create distaste from how it was created, but the product itself is not devalued or valued more. And then again, often you can see in something that it has some kind of ideology that you don't appreciate or anything, but I don't buy into that, because I think it should be a goal when you see some painting or listen to a piece of music or see a sculpture, that you regard it as if you didn't know the background from it. Imagine how many works at museums or at that you see the fountains in Rome or something that you do not know the story of, and you appreciate it. You miss so much if you're supposed to judge everything ethically, and then it goes into a vicious circle, and suddenly you cannot appreciate anything. It becomes like this woke statue tearing down, that as soon as you start to bring ethics into the work, to the product, to the piece of art, then it easily goes slippery slope, that then suddenly everything is supposed to be of the highest standard.
Exactly, because then everything is judged on ethical terms, and I think that this really does interfere with the creation of art, which itself should, I think, be distanced from all of that. Of course, there's going to be circumstances behind everything that's created, and of course, if you look back at the muddy history of composers, many of them have had horrible lives and they've done terrible things, and the same thing is true of political figures. Not many were perfect. Of course, when they are perfect, we should try to imitate them. But in Australia, for instance, some of our early architecture is quite beautiful, and some of the most European, looking architecture there is. But it gets criticized because there's a connection there to invasion of the indigenous peoples. So, that's an example of where we should value the art for its own sake, but we're interfering with it based on external factors, based on the politics and the ethics of the people who created them.
Yeah, and then if you accept that argument, then you don't own the history yourself, or you don't own what you're talking about. The people who are or at least are said to be offended by something, then they don't own their own history. The way to do that is to see what wrongdoings that has been done and then say that was terrible and should not be repeated. But of course, it doesn't have anything to do with this new building that looks like something that was built during that era. It doesn't make rational sense. It's just symbolism and some mystical connection that is drawn between two different buildings that are, if you use architecture as an example, that has some kind of connection.
There's a fear though, of course, that people worry that they're endorsing that ideology by consuming the music or the art.
Yeah, but then again, if you accept that, then you also lose all the benefits, because I think here it's either or to a large degree, not completely, but to a large degree. I think it's you also lose that very beautiful part of culture that is that to use an example, during the Cold War, at the worst during the Cold War, the Russians, they have always been very great with culture, and they disregarded the Cold War and invited Van Cliburn, the American pianist, to come to Moscow, and they praised him, and he won the I guess it was the Tchaikovsky competition, that is the highest competition to win in Russia, and and of course the Khrushchev could have, he decided who won. He could have said, don't give it to an American, and but he didn't, because culture is above politics. It's about human connection, and then you disregard that. And it was, he loved the Russians loved him, and he was praised as the talent he was. And yeah.
Something else, which, and you were right when you mentioned before about the the fountains of Rome, for example, and that you may not know the history or the story of them, but you already, you can fall in love with them without knowing any of that. I think that over time, currently we still live in a charged time for today and the feelings of today's politics and all those sorts of things. But the art that survives from our time in 1,000 years will not have those associations anymore. It may, I think over time, the further away you go, the more it just gets viewed for its aesthetic qualities rather than the connections that it had at the time. So for example, the way we think of Egypt now, it would take someone a very strong stretch of the imagination to go to Egypt today, see the pyramids and go, and just feel that pain and feel angry and want to get revenge on, those people for being so tyrannical. And and likewise, again, like for example, North Korea, a very politically hostile country at the moment, but a lot of the art they create, in fact, you could say that they're one of the biggest producers in the world of representational art, because they're producing propaganda, which is meant to be very beautiful because it's meant to persuade people about the regime. And right now we can condemn that, it's true. It's true that representational art, that beautiful work, does persuade people in this. It leans them towards this way, or at least it keeps them trapped in that system. But in the future, as the regime collapses and our thoughts of it change, we can appreciate those works for what they are, that there were craftsmen behind it, whose names we probably will never know, who created these excellent pieces of art. So it's the same kind of idea, I think. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Although it's not the same, but it's if a father is a bad person, it's maybe a human reflex to then think bad of the child as well. But it's not right. The child doesn't have anything to do with his the father or mother's personality, and although it's different because it's an individual, it's still something that a person has created, that is a product, and not and it's not a manifestation of that person or something, and all the values.
Absolutely. One final question I wanted to ask you is just on the idea of universal values and that kind of thing. I would make the case that pop culture, and as we've already talked about in film, that universal values permeate our culture widely. It's a reality that people want to hear stories that mean something, that tell a story and are engaging. But since these are universal values, it's not surprising that they show up. But I wanted to ask, why is it then that classical culture, classical painting, architecture, music, why have all of these sort of lost their pride of place in the culture and been replaced, not perhaps by an inferior product, but by something different? I'll leave it there.
I will try to answer it short. I think it's mainly two reasons, and one of them is that, or not, the one is not reason, but just an explanation, that pop culture has always existed, but it's not remembered. It's not what is carried forth in history. You can just go 100 years back in your own country and see what was the most popular authors, and usually most of them are not popular today, and same with musicians and with many things. It's but there has always been this classic, or not always, but mostly been this classical realm that has sometimes been stronger, sometimes weaker, but it has been there because it is this universal, and it's put so much effort into it and so much thought into it that it is worth keeping. It becomes a product of so high quality that it's worth keeping. So it's easy to forget that it was a lot of trashy pop culture back in like 700 years ago, but no one knows what it is today. And of course that sometimes it was way less than it is today. Definitely, I think it was, when you hear like Green Sleeves from Great Britain, when it was that was supposed to be one of the popular songs. It's such a beautiful song. So of course at times it was of higher quality, but then I think that another reason is that although it's a benefit that the average of education has risen today, that's a very good benefit, that people, it's not like a Charles Dickens novel where most children are not educated. It's great that all people get education, but I think that the most educated people carries the classical culture further, are way less educated than the most educated in earlier times. You can just see when you read many of the people who are remembered that were highly educated. They knew so many languages, and they played instruments, and they spoke 7 languages, and they wrote and they composed and they did everything because that was high education at that time. But now it's you are highly educated if you have a PhD.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to play into cliches, but I do think that things like television, the internet have pulled us away, so to speak, from having the time to do all these things. And then I think there's just the cultural assumption now that everything can be found on the internet or in a book. It doesn't need to be learned, or you don't need it yourself. You can just look it up, and that may be part of the reason why we don't aspire to be such scholars that they may have in the Renaissance. But you make a really good point in your first point there, that we shouldn't think about classical culture as being really popular in the past, and that it's a problem now that it's not big anymore. It's more a matter of, why do we even have it at all? Why do we still have any classical culture at all? And that's because of the universal values that they convey. The fact that they, perhaps something that is rare, but they have transcended their culture. They've transcended just a particular historical time, and they're able to keep being used today. Because, of course, history is not something that just exists in the past. It has to keep being renewed every day. So I suppose that's part of the reason. Now, did you have a question for me before we finish?
Yes, it's just a very, very short question. Here is the magazine, that Civilisation magazine, and we actually wrote about something that was very relevant to what we talked about. There is, namely, we had one section about classical architecture, and one of them is about the Scots College.
Yes. Yeah, I'm aware of it.
Sydney.
I'm sorry?
I'm just curious, and outside Sydney. And it's such a beautiful, beautiful building, or the plan of building is so beautiful. I'm just curious, do you know any of the what has happened to it? Will it be built, or is it cancelled? Or
yeah, it's strange. Actually, because I read about that from listening to some of the talks on YouTube, and I looked at their website. It seems like it's in construction now and maybe finished next year. But yeah, we'll have to see. I've definitely planned to have a look at it myself when it's done, because this is actually a very rare thing in Australia. When you follow pages on Facebook like the New Traditional Architecture, there are new projects in Russia all the time. There's renovations and beautiful things in Europe, but in Australia, it's such a last. It's possibly the only thing that we don't do here. We don't have a single sort of scene for that type of innovation. Every art convention, well, I guess like other parts of the world, but there's just no avenue to pursue classical thought other than a small and ever-shrinking humanities department of the universities. Yeah, so unfortunately I don't know about the story there. What I can tell you is another story, an anecdote, because I went to St. Andrew's College, which is a Scottish college, and I know some of the other colleges nearby. I think that trends towards classicism come and go, I think. About 14 years ago, at one of the other colleges, they needed to build a new wing to accommodate just a few more officers and accommodation. And they chose to use the highest quality sandstone and make it perfectly fit with their 19th century wings of the building. And to the point that if you didn't go up to the plaque and see that it was built in the 21st century, you would think it was historical. And that just struck me as a very rare thing, and very, very admirable that they were able to do it so well. But of course, that cost them a very, very large amount of money for such a small project. It was only about one wing, and it ended up blowing up into tens of millions of dollars. In recent times, I think costs have risen in all fields, but especially in construction, and everyone has had to budget everything so carefully now. We had our own wing built with a very, very generous. If you don't know sandstone is in Australia sort of our local style of building material, yeah. And they built a very nicely done sandstone-clad building of our college about 20 years ago. Also pretty sympathetically done, but not particularly tasteful. No ornaments. We couldn't get that. And then just 2 years ago, we had a new wing constructed, a brand new building. And by this point, it already reflects the budgeting that has happened, and just, I think, not enough appreciation for the heritage, because we got again, we're a Scottish college. We have a very Scottish baronial style main hall. But now this new accommodation building is basically 5 stories of glass with a very, very thin, like the thinnest imaginable sandstone veneer, just sort of covering portions of it to make it look like it wasn't just an accident, which is a real shame. And that's the way that Sydney seems to be going with this architecture. There's a big problem with cost. And there's just not enough care. There's not enough care for it. So what Scots College is doing is a very, very rare thing and very admirable. And I imagine that even though it's expensive, the prices will go up even more as they build it. And I'm sure the pandemic contributed to that. But yeah, I do get excited about these stories. I do. And I'm not just a classicist in my preference. I very much like modern buildings that have good proportions, that express, a human element, I suppose, and are not trying to, also symmetrical. I'm sick of these buildings that are just so, they're like serial barcodes and things now. So
it's not black and white, so that's the classical aspects of it.
Absolutely, yeah. There are things that you can appreciate in someone's vision, even if you don't appreciate the whole project. Yeah, well, Carl Korsnes, absolutely a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much. Really wonderful to talk about so many different topics with you, not just music.
Yeah, we covered so many topics, and this was pure joy.
Your magazine have you published it in English yet?
Not yet, but we're looking for finance, because of course we do not accept governmental funding. So we're looking for finance, and if we get it, we will go international and publish it in English.
But you do have English articles on your website?
Yeah, a few, but not all of them. So yeah.
Well, I'll definitely direct my viewers there, and I'm sure they'd love to hear more about what you have to say and what you've written down. Are you also working on publications at the moment?
Yeah, I'm working on some projects, but they're still in the idea phase.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, because I'm trying to build my music channel beyond just performance, but really to the core issues of and why I'm doing this, which is not just to perform and that's it. It's really to share my views about what culture should be and how we're going to get there. So, and I'm really glad that we have people from across the world who share this view. And in Norway, I imagine a lot of my viewers aren't aware that there is a big following of classical painters there. Perhaps the biggest there is, or steadily growing?
It's steadily growing. It's mostly thanks to the Norwegian painter Odd Nerdrum. He has a large following group and has taken students for more than 50 years.
Well, that just shows how far one person with a vision can go, without government help, I assume.
Yes, without.
On that note, thank you very much for the talk, and thanks for wearing a cravat too. Love it.
Yeah, you too.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Carl. Take care. Bye.